Hi everyone, welcome to our special Friday the 13th horror podcast. I'm Creepy Critic Claire.
And I'm the fan geek, the freaky fan geek.
Jesus, don't know about that voice. We're going to talk about horror films today, and at first when we were talking about doing this, I thought, that's easy. We both love horror films. That'd be a piece of cake. But the more research I did, I realised there's so many horror films out there that we really needed to narrow our focus. So today we're going to be focusing on, and this is a narrow focus mind you, 25 important American horror films of the 70s and 80s. So I'm just going to first of all start off with a little bit of backstory and introduction as to how we came about with that. Then we're going to define the horror genre, talk a little bit about the subgenres, and then we're going to go through our 25 important horror films. Sound good?
Sounds awesome.
Cool. So, obviously there are horror films prior to the 1970s, and there are a lot of important films such as Nosferatu that were quite early and paved the way for later productions. If you look at things like comics, books, television, other films that have horror elements, obviously you can see that there were a lot of influential moments. And the 1960s was also a very important time because the horror films in American cinema were mainly B and C grade films that had sci-fi elements or other generic elements. So in the 1960s we start to see, we start to see horror films starting to enter mainstream popular American cinema. And I'm thinking about things like Rosemary's Baby, which was the Roman Polanski directed film in 1968. But even earlier than that, one of my favourite directors, Alfred Hitchcock, had his 1960 film Psycho. That's right. And also The Birds, 1963. Yes, we're not above using hammy, cheap sound effects at all here on the podcast. And those films were influential because they entered the mainstream. They weren't just regarded as B or C grade films and cult films. So it is important to say that even though we're focusing on the American horror films of the 70s and 80s, there's a body of work that's quite significant that came beforehand. But we can't go into all of that. And I also need to mention two more things. The English cinema production house Hammer House, they were also quite influential in the horror films, and also in Italy, the Giallo Italian horror film movement. But we will talk about those another time. So, Cable, horror films, what do you think when we talk about the genre? What comes to mind for you?
I think being scared, really. I think that's the main thing. You want to go to the cinema. You sort of know what you're in for to a point, and you want to be scared. You want to be on the edge of your seat. You want some cheap scares, I guess.
Cheap thrills.
Well, yeah. I wasn't allowed to watch too much horror when I was a kid, so I think for me it was a very taboo kind of genre. So for me to sort of sneak out or get to a friend's house or somehow get a copy of it, Nightmare on Elm Street on video or Halloween or something like that was always kind of exciting, and watching it in the dark and when mum and dad weren't home, it was always, you always felt like I felt like I was doing the wrong thing. So, and it sort of leads into, I guess, a lot of the characters that are in these movies, or the victims, potential victims, young teenagers doing things they're not supposed to be doing, sex, booze, drugs, and yeah.
Exactly, I agree. Well, and that leads us into, when we think about horror, some of the generic devices, and you and I came up with a few things. The films are usually always set at night. There's always a threat or monster. There's always in isolation, and there's a lot of these movies that have teenagers, and the adults are quite useless, or as you said, Cable, they're often the threat or the monster. And you've also got the shock value. There's always something there to shock you emotionally or psychologically. And also that fear. We like to be scared. And the way they do it, they use music, lighting, editing, camera angles, and obviously makeup and special effects. So that's what we're talking about when we refer to horror movies. But of course, the other thing to keep in mind is, like many films, when you're talking about genre, or it's not restricted to films, but there are a lot of subgenres. So, for example, some of the films on our list come from sci-fi, supernatural, slasher, rape, revenge, paranormal, thriller, and we're not looking at it today in much detail, but also the more recent phenomena they've labelled torture porn. I'm not a fan of the torture porn, I must say. I draw the line. I seem to be getting a little...
just normal porn.
Yeah. No torture, no porn, nothing. I seem to be getting a bit of a scaredy cat in my old age. But...
just quickly on that point, I think that some of the early movies, especially Saw being one of the sort of more famous ones of recent times, are using that more torture porn. The first one or two movies were good in that respect, but I think in trying to up the ante every Halloween when those movies were released, that it got more to the point where it was just ridiculous amounts of torture porn, or more grotesque and a lot more gore. And I think that's what's happened with a lot of horror movies recent times. Instead of being smart with your editing, your music and your scares, it's all about who can do the worst, who can have the more grotesque death scene,
yes,
or violence. And I think that has probably taken away from horror. I think it's not about smarts; it's about who can outdo who and make a death scene much more elaborate and grotesque or gross, whatever you want to say. I think that's enough said on that. But I think torture porn has its place, but I think it's probably taken horror in the wrong direction, or people feel the new horror filmmakers have unfortunately maybe started veering that way as well, instead of being smart enough to use their editing skills and their acting and locations and music and all that sort of stuff to bring out the scares.
I agree. It is very one note. It's relying on this one trick in your bag. And if you think about a lot of the films we're going to talk about in the podcast today, they are more about being groundbreaking, not necessarily that it's never been done before, but the way that things have done, or introducing new ideas. And it's more of I call it a dark imagination. It's thinking about different things, like if we think about Hellraiser and Pinhead, although now we might look at that and go, oh, bitch please, that's so 80s. But back at the time, it was a refreshing, different part of the dark imagination. But anyway, so why don't we move on now to let's talking about our 25 important American horror films. And I will post this list on the website, and the website will be up and running shortly, I promise. So you can actually come onto our website and comment, add some films you think that are really important that we didn't include, or start a debate about. So the website is www.fanfilmtvcritic.com, and please come on down and have a look and post and see what you think. So let's start now. I think for me, the 70s was quite an important time for the slasher film. So, Cable, do you want to start us off with the slasher film, talking a bit about that?
I will, but can I just also say, before anyone goes forward in this podcast, there will unfortunately be spoilers, I guess. So we probably should say that we don't want to ruin a film for you. So if you feel like we mentioned something you haven't seen, maybe not listen for the next minute or so.
Or next 40 minutes.
Yeah. What do we say? Slasher film.
Yes. Because Halloween is usually regarded as one of the first, films to sort of bring in that genre.
Yeah. And I reckon that would have been probably one of the first movies of that type that I saw as a kid. Having this well, we did know who he was, but this sort of still fairly unknown person in his jumpsuit and mask, pretty much with a kitchen knife, walking around and just deciding that cutting people up was a fun thing to do.
But his identity, I mean, it's interesting because his identity wasn't really known. We knew his name, but what did we know about the character?
We didn't get a hell of a lot of backstory, and that's what makes it, I guess, more creepy as well. You get a little bit of a tidbit, so you got to get a little bit of a feel, but there's a lot of blanks that need to be filled in, and then he's come back, he's back in town, and why he's back, why he's escaped sort of the mental institution, and then what is his agenda, or is he that psychotic that, or beyond repair or understanding of what he's actually doing. That actually makes it even creepier. I think with a lot of, again, sometimes some horror villains don't really have a great backstory or don't have enough mystique about them that make them scary enough. If you know too much, sometimes it just doesn't make a good villain.
I think also you touched on something else which I think was important, and that is that no one believes that such a creature could exist. Donald Pleasance, who plays Michael Myers' physician in the mental institution, when he breaks out of the institution, and of course it's a dark, rainy night because the rain all of a sudden makes it spookier. But when the doctor is travelling to Michael Myers' hometown and goes to the police, the sheriff, they don't really believe him. They are cynical and doubt what danger really lies ahead. And that sets it up nicely because we know that as a child he killed his sister. We don't really know much else about him, but his level of alarm gives us a nice taste of what could be the potential for his victims. I also want to note Halloween because of the music too. I recently watched Halloween and The Exorcist, and the music is actually quite similar, and in fact there's scenes which are almost mirrored. There's a scene where Jamie Lee Curtis's character is walking down the street at Halloween time, obviously on Halloween, with the Halloween theme music, and then there's another scene in The Exorcist with Chris McNeil, Linda Blair's mother, in The Exorcist, and the similar music, Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield, is playing as she walks down that Halloween footpath in Washington, and they could almost be the same scene, which I find really interesting. Anyway, so with Halloween, I think also it sets up the horror heroine too. There are a lot of these movies where, for some reason, and for those of you that love the film Scream by Wes Craven, you know the rules. They talk about, or Jamie Kennedy's character talks about the rules, and one of them is that women that are virgins are the ones that survive.
I think that was all virgins. Mainly the females, but I think it's in reference to all.
Yes.
Because even his character survived because he was a virgin.
Yes, okay. But in these earlier films, I'm just trying to cast my mind back.
Well, even Alien was very sort of groundbreaking in that
Yes.
it used a female heroine or survivor.
Yes.
In Sigourney Weaver.
Yes.
And at the time, I think, I'm pretty sure in one of the documentaries they did state that there was obviously a male character that was supposed to outlive all of them and, kill the alien and save the day kind of thing, and then they flipped it on its head saying, how about we try it with a female?
Yes.
And obviously that, I think, even though Halloween did come that year before, I think definitely those two movies paved the way to have the female heroine and say, well, it's not just a man's world,
Yes.
It could be anyone that can outlive the threat.
Yes.
And
Because in Friday the 13th, it's great that the I can't remember her name, but she survives. So she's a female that survives, a female character. But then in the second one, she's killed in the first scene. That's like so heartbreaking. So
and looking back on it, it's very I don't know. I don't believe it was almost real in the second one. I don't know. It just seemed a bit too out of the ordinary for a death scene. I think it was like a cheap scare, or because people didn't think she'd get killed because she survived the first one. But look, they did it. It's been done, so can't really take it back. But
well, I also think
it doesn't actually sync with the rest of the story, really.
No. Well, it's interesting because the woman the actress that played that character, she because she became quite famous because of since the release of the film, and she didn't want to be. She actually asked for her character to be killed off. She didn't want to be in any of the other films, and they said, "Well, look, to tie it up nicely, how about you just come back for this scene and we'll do that." So it's interesting. I wonder how much behind the scenes things influence the story and the actual genre. I was also going to mention Nightmare on Elm Street again. Is it Nancy that survives and gets the charming grey streak in her hair? Yeah. She was so cool. That film came out when I was in primary school, and she was just the coolest because I had mousy brown, thin, straight hair, and she had funky wavy hair, and she was just cool because she could outsmart Freddy. Yeah. It's actually like a horror Home Alone. Really, if you think about the booby traps and everything else was very clever. I also, just going back to the slasher genre, I also think we need to talk about Friday the 13th as quite an influential film on the genre as well. What thoughts did you have on that film? Friday the 13th.
On the original?
Yes.
I think it was definitely a interesting film because if you haven't seen the movie, but the villain is a woman or the killer.
Yes.
She has resentment for the loss of her son Jason, or believed loss of son Jason, because the neglect of the camp counsellors or the people that were running the Camp Crystal were negligent in their duties in looking after him and some of the other kids. So her whole thing is about revenge, and then anyone that sort of does the drugs and having sex and not doing their duty as Camp Crystal sort of employees sort of face the wrath of Mrs. Voorhees. And it was sort of, I think, groundbreaking for me as well, because again, that was one of the earlier films I saw, and I think having a woman as a killer, and especially an older woman, is quite different.
Yes.
You normally have some psychotic male or someone that's quite big, or like I said, someone's a bit more supernatural or something like that, so has something about them. The twist of her being the killer was really surprising. And then obviously they had to tack on the end, just in case they wanted sequels, they had to have a quick appearance of Jason right at the end.
Yes.
To lead us into part 2 and part 3 and so on.
Two things I'd like to mention before I comment on the appearance of Jason. For anyone that is a media studies or cinema studies student, Barbara Creed, who's a Melbourne University academic, wrote a great book on female killers in horror films called Monstrous Feminine, and it looks into the Freudian reading of why women are killers and goes into the Oedipus complex and all of that. So that's a key text for anyone that's interested in studying or reading about this even further. The other thing is, I don't have quite as cynical a view as you do about the reappearance of Jason at the end of the first one. I think it's all part of that mindfuck that is part of horror film, that it's so horrific, it's so awful that it can't be real. It sort of tests the boundaries of real and unreal and the imagination, and I think having him come up and grab her at the end, we don't really know, was it real? Did she just imagine it? Has the poor bitch got post-traumatic stress disorder and sitting in a boat thinking about, what's happened, and did she imagine it? Was it real? And I kind of really like that play, because isn't the whole thing with horror is that obviously there is real threats, but particularly if you look at the supernatural horror, in some of the horror or the threat is imagined, or they leave a question mark. So I'm a little bit, for once, usually I'm quite cynical, for once I'm less cynical on that one. But also, we should just quickly mention other slasher films that we've got on our list. So we've got The Hills Have Eyes, Nightmare on Elm Street.
Which is probably my favourite.
Yes.
I should say.
And we've also got The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I think we should talk about that, because that is I think it's quite an influential film. Did you want to talk? Did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original, the second movie with Dennis Hopper was banned in Australia for a long time, so a lot of people probably even never seen it. The first one was groundbreaking because I think they used, the isolation of having their car break down, but being almost in the middle of nowhere, or being somewhere in Texas, and not knowing anyone, not being able to contact kind of the outside world, and obviously back before the days of mobile phones and all that sort of stuff, and just going to a little house and trying to get more help, and then obviously one by one they all sort of get picked off, and even the way Tobe Hooper shot it, I think it was very raw. And there's some parts of the movie, the brother that's in the wheelchair, I think when he gets one of his legs cut by a chainsaw, I'm pretty sure that I remember thinking, the blood looks a bit too red, looks a bit fake. But then there's other parts of that movie with the music and just the quick shock value. It's not about the blood and gore; it's just a lot of it's implied.
Yes.
And it's just the terror that the characters, the actors portray, that sort of just give off that, just look, it blew my mind. I think it's a very intense movie, and there was parts of it that I felt like it felt real, especially at the end when our female character, her name escapes me, but she escapes, and the way she's just screaming down the road and hysterical, which who wouldn't be?
Yes.
I think that was so raw. And it was almost like had this documentary feel to it, because it was shot so. It was obviously done very cheaply.
Squishy.
So yeah, absolutely, and even just the narration at the start and the end, to make it feel like this really happened as well. That was amazing technique or idea that they came up with, saying that it was a true story, which people probably know now that it wasn't. It was based on something that happened actually in Wisconsin. There was one guy that had these, issues, a bit like Leatherface, the character, but it wasn't a whole family. It wasn't in Texas, but you could believe something would happen like that. I mean, I haven't driven across America, but it does make you think, and I think that's something that would scare me. It's like breaking down somewhere in the middle of nowhere, or picking up a hitchhiker and having issues that way. So
yes. I think a lot of these movies, and I think Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you're right, it is drawn upon a number of different real-life events, and one of them, the most famous being, is Ed Gein, the serial killer, the American serial killer, and who actually made, suits out of human skin and robbed graves and ended up decapitating his mother and having sex with her headless body. As you do. But anyway, so I think the thing is that, it does the titillation of that it could be true, that suggestion is very powerful, and I agree, the way that it's shot, that very gritty, cheap documentary feel. I did actually watch it recently, and I apologise, the character's names escaped me, but the guy in the wheelchair was basically really annoying and a whiny bitch.
Yeah. I agree.
It was great because you do connect with the characters, and you don't necessarily want the characters to die. But then with the guy in the wheelchair, I was like, just Leatherface, go nuts. Like, you know, end this painful dude. So I think the thing is that one of the pleasures of horror stories is that sometimes you are wanting the characters to survive, and you're behind them, and you're hoping that they make it. But sometimes you're like, just kill them, you know, and it's also quite possibly cathartic, because in our society, it's obviously you can't hurt people and kill people. It's not legal. It's very antisocial. But sometimes, you know, we have these ideas or fantasies that I just want to inflict pain on that person because they're really annoying. And by the way, I don't want to hurt anyone. I don't think this, but sometimes it's quite cathartic to have this monster come in and just get rid of an annoying character. But I agree. I also like the twist, and I'm not sure if I'm confusing Texas Chainsaw Massacre now with Devil's Rejects, or is it a House of a Thousand Corpses? Where was it the sheriff is in on it? Is the sheriff in on it with the family? Because remember when she runs down the road and she thinks that she's been saved, and then she realises that she's going back to the house where the family is. That twist.
That's in the new one. Is that what was... Sorry?
Is that in the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre?
No. That's in...
House of a Thousand Corpses. It is in House of a Thousand Corpses, which is Rob Zombie. So I apologise. I'm getting my horror films confused. So I think on our list, so just to go over our list, for slasher films we have Friday the 13th, we have Halloween, we have Nightmare on Elm Street, and we have the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So we're going to move on now to supernatural, the subgenre, because a lot of the films on the list I have put down as supernatural. So we've got, I'll just read off some of the supernatural ones. We've got Amityville Horror, An American Werewolf in London, Evil Dead, The Exorcist, Fright Night, Hellraiser, The Howling, The Lost Boys, Nightmare on Elm Street, I've got that twice, The Omen, and The Shining. I've got Poltergeist down, but as paranormal. So let's talk about supernatural. Cable, out of those movies, which one would you say holds a special place in your heart?
I don't want to bring it up again, but probably Nightmare on Elm Street.
You can bring it up as many times as you want.
Oh, I didn't want to have to bring it up twice, but I think,
okay.
Like you said, you've kind of put it in the two categories, and it sort of does. It has that slasher aspect, but obviously playing on that whole dream scenario where Freddy's all about getting kids in. You know, he was a serial killer or a molester, or whatever you want to say, and then obviously he gets killed or by vigilante parents.
Yes.
And then you've got him in a dream sequence, or in his dreams now he can kill these kids. So I guess that whole aspect of going to sleep, and like we all know, we all have nightmares, whether we're kids, adults, we still have bad dreams and stuff like that. So I think it plays on that element that, you know, sometimes going to bed and having those feelings and waking up scared, and I think I don't know what else I can sort of say. I just think I really enjoy that movie, and I know some people look back at it and laugh. Some of the death scenes are ridiculous and whatever. And look, some of them are a bit corny, but you got to think about them. They're not necessarily supposed to be straightforward and set in this world. I guess they're in a dream sequence, so we all have dreams that feel very real, but then have those parts of them that are a bit too unreal, or you know, you've won Tatslotto, or you're with your best friend, but you're in Paris or whatever, like just stuff that may not ever really happen. So I think sometimes when I talk to the younger generation, when they see those movies, they don't really rate Nightmare on Elm Street because of that, and it's like, well, I think you've missed the point. You're not supposed. The death scenes aren't supposed to be straightforward.
But we are very spoiled. I mean, if you think about films today and how sophisticated they are in terms of not just the technology and CGI, but also in terms of these grand narratives like Lord of the Rings, and the expense and the scope of these films. we are very, very spoiled. And so if you were to introduce a young audience, say young adults in their early 20s, that have not watched a lot of classic cinema or classic Hollywood or older films, if you were to show them something like The Birds, they would just laugh at you and just not care that it was the first and only film to never have a music score, and that it was, regarded as a horror film in its time. They would just laugh at you. And the thing is that, so there is that, you've got to place it in its context. But one of the things I loved about Nightmare on Elm Street, it is my era too, and I loved the teen culture aspect. I loved the fact that, obviously we get Johnny Depp, one of his first roles, and also the having your own phone in your own bedroom. That was so huge in the 80s. Yeah. Like, that was the quintessential kind of teen accoutrement, the thing to have. And I liked all of that. Also the rebellion, being in class, not sleeping, dreaming of Tina in her body bag, blood-soaked. My favourite scenes are the bath scene with that famous hand coming up, and also the phone with the tongue.
Yeah.
And I found that had elements of comedy, almost mocking teens, like, talking on the phone to your boyfriend, oh, I love you, mocking all of that. And so it's quite, I know it's a cheap mainstream, and I don't mean cheap as in production, but I mean it's sort of like a mainstream popular American film, but there's a lot in there. Wes Craven, I mean, man, he's the horror master.
Yeah. I was just about to bring that up, but I think that's the other thing we've seen recent years. We've seen remakes of Halloween, and there's talks about another sort of Halloween reboot. We saw a remake of Nightmare on Elm Street. Friday the 13th had a remake. Obviously, there's more money invested in those movies now, so the production values are better. The special effects, like you said, the CGI and that. The thing I love about these films, you got to put, like you said, put them in their context. They were done on the cheap. Because horror films weren't, like I said, the mainstream. They were more that the teens would go and see them. It wasn't going to have your big audience. People would go to the drive-ins, and they were a bit hit and miss. So you had to, try and get your investors on board or your studios to make the horror film firstly, and then you've got to try and do your special effects. And even watching documentaries on Nightmare on Elm Street, some of the effects in this day and age don't look absolutely fantastic, but some of them, for what they were able to do without CGI and even special effects, it was just, everything was very done practically.
Yes.
I think it's amazing, especially Johnny Depp's first movie, Nightmare on Elm Street, his death scene, even just watching a documentary, how they did that to make it look like he was sucked into the bed and then the blood spew out. You sort of think, well, how they do that, and just seems so simple, but it took some time, it took a bit of money, but they made it work, and it looks fantastic.
The other thing I wanted to say, relating also not just to Nightmare on Elm Street, but back to Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I also feel these two films are significant for their use of sound effects that are terrifying. How many of us have heard, since watching Nightmare on Elm Street, metal scraped across metal in that really jarring, spooky way, and Freddy Krueger's laugh? And similarly in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, that when you're pumping the chainsaw, which they used to great effect in the film American Psycho, those sounds, because of the use in these films, take on again a different meaning, which is full on. We need to whip along, so we're going to have some other horror podcasts, because there's too many things that we have to talk about. Yeah. I really want to just talk about some key films in the supernatural genre. And for me, there's three that really stand out as super, super important for me. And that is Evil Dead, The Exorcist, and The Omen. I'm going to do it chronologically. So The Exorcist is, I think, and we might have to check this, but it's one of the very few films that's won 2 Oscars. Won an Oscar for Best Sound and Oscar for Best Screenplay. It's based on the William Peter Blatty's novel, and he worked as a consultant on the film, actually. and he
Can I
adapted
jump
the
in?
screenplay.
Is the book that he's written,
Yes.
is that completely fictionalised, or is it based on another true event? Or
He alleges that there was a real life possession in Africa of an 8-year-old boy, and he has adapted that as inspiration.
Okay, yeah.
So the book itself he regards as fiction, but he has based it on.
Right.
So it's not intended to be a documentary literal, but it's based on. So there's a lot of creative license. I was talking to Cable about this, and I grew up as a Catholic, and I remember being in primary school and receiving a letter home because an edited screening of The Exorcist was on TV, and kids were coming to school talking about it, which was so exciting. And that, for me, as you said earlier, it's that taboo. It's that you shouldn't be watching this, and of course that just makes it even more alluring. I love this film. I watch it over and over and over. I still, even today, watch both. I prefer the director's cut. And I've got the making of documentary of it. I think it's a great film, not just because of it. First of all, it tried to cover something quite far-fetched, but it did so in a way that it looked at the psychological and emotional states of the characters. It wasn't just about giving you pea green vomit and talking in English backwards in a dark, spooky devil voice. The film was interested in giving you a bit of depth, which I think was good. What do you think of this film?
Do you really want my honest opinion?
Well,
we've already had that conversation.
If you want the claws are out.
If you want to have the listeners. Oh, look, honestly, I didn't see it as young as you did, and obviously you have probably a different background, and in that way you've got a different context of how you see that movie or how you view it. For me, and I did go to Sunday school when I was a kid, and I had an interest in religion and stuff like that, but growing up I'm sort of a bit more on the atheist side of things, so something like that, they can be hit and miss, and I felt like I understand why it's very important in the scheme of everything horror, and I know why it's always mentioned. I appreciate that, but it's just one of those movies I felt early on is very slow to get into it, and yeah, look, the effects, and there were some creepy bits, but maybe because again, didn't see it in the right context, didn't see it when it first sort of came out, and seen stuff since. I just felt like it was like, it wasn't much, didn't do much for me, didn't scare me. Whereas I know, at the time there's people walking out of cinemas vomiting, and people leaving cinemas when it first came out, and there was, in the subsequent years when it came out in video, and that people just couldn't sit through it. People had really, really bad or negative reactions to that movie. So maybe subconsciously I went into the movie thinking, I was expecting this just...
Yeah.
I don't know what I was expecting, but you sort of expect it to just be absolutely morbid and ghastly and grotesque, and for me it wasn't. It was a bit more spiritual and maybe a bit more, like I'm saying, a bit more serious, a bit more dealing with issues of, possession and religion and stuff like that. So probably had a lot more deeper meanings, and it probably more on a conscious level is more, supposed to be frightening that way instead of being in your face.
And I think the other thing too is with horror films you do kind of have to, I think that you get maximum enjoyment by being willing to give up a lot of claims to sort of credibility and say, I know this is kind of possibly not real, or basically outright not real, but take me for a ride. I'm prepared to sort of go on this journey with you and let me see how well you can transport me into your world. And I think the calibre of actors in The Exorcist as well, for me, works on that level too. I've just forgotten who plays her mother. Linda Blair's obviously Regan. Chris McNeil is played by... I've just gone blank. Anyway, she is an amazing actress, and she did a fantastic job as this mother, not just distraught over her daughter, but also...
Ellen Bernstein.
Thank you. Yes, she's fantastic. Even just the scenes on Regan's birthday when her father doesn't call, just those little touches, I think, for me, work well in a horror film and worked well in this instance. Let's move on because...
Before we move on, just quickly,
sure, yes.
Did you actually meet Linda Blair when she came out last year?
No, I did not. Did you?
No, now that I've realised or come to know that you're a big fan, I just thought that might have been something.
No, I didn't.
Oh, well.
I did note her brief appearance in Supernatural and the jokes about pea green soup and her company, and I always have admiration for people that can laugh at themselves, so good on you, Linda. Another great and important film for me on a similar theme was The Omen. Again, this, as you were describing the reactions in the cinemas, similarly, The Omen caused quite an uproar with the Catholic Church, and a lot of people were trying to get the film banned at the time. The Omen is one of those films that, again, depending, and as you said, depending on your background, you might be just like, this is a whole lot of crap. But if you're willing to entertain the notion and go on the ride. Also, again, this had a good cast. It had, is it Gregory Peck? Yes, Gregory Peck, as the distraught father. And there was also some great support cast. The man that played the photographer, the man that played the priest, all really strong performances. I loved The Omen because, again, there's this taboo around children and innocence and children and evil. And it raised that quite profoundly in The Omen. And I think that's, again, not the first film to do so. I think there's a early 40s film called The Evil Seeds or The Bad Seeds, which obviously did that. But The Omen in mainstream cinema, it was important that it did that. So that's why I think it's a great film. What did you think of The Omen?
Oh, look, I saw it a long, long time ago, and I feel like in a galaxy far, far away. So most of what you've just said, I agree with. Again, it within its context, it is a scary film, and it's definitely got a place in your top notch of horror films. But I guess I think if you don't have maybe a religious background, it may be, again, one of those films that doesn't really, you probably won't get much out of, maybe. Did they remake?
Yes, they did.
Yeah.
And I went and saw it. It was released, are you ready? It was released on the 6th of June 2006.
Yeah.
666, and I went with a friend of mine at the time, and we sat in the cinema with all the goths and watched the remake.
I think, was the photographer David Warner?
I can't remember, but it's got Julia Stiles and Naomi Watts' partner. What's his name?
I know the new one. I'm talking about the original one.
The original one.
The great acting.
Oh yes, yeah. I can't remember the name.
I think it is David Warner, and he does pop up in a few horror films here and there. And yes. He was actually one of the sort of main characters in the movie I was named after. So I've always sort of looked at David Warner and enjoyed his works. So yeah. And
I think the final film in the supernatural genre that we need to touch on, of course, is Evil Dead. This came out in 1981, so I was too young to go and see that at the cinemas.
Yeah,
even too young for VHS. I was 16 the first time I saw this.
Okay. Yeah, I was probably still in nappies and wearing a bib.
Thanks, Gable. And I remember just a quick story which I think adds to the thrill of this film. It was very scandalous. My boyfriend at the time and I were at his house, and it was in the dark, and his mother had a lot of tchotchkes and statues, and so there were a lot of shadows being cast. And the scene where the girl who's drawing, she kind of starts to become a little, NQR, not quite right. I wanted a toilet break, so we paused it. I went to the toilet, and my boyfriend had the brilliant idea of lying down on the ground and just grabbing my ankle as I walked past, and I think screamed for about 5 minutes without taking a breath. And I think that, the ambience of and the context, as we've said, when you're watching a film, that can really add or detract from the film. This is famous, of course, the tree raping scene. Again, it looks at possession, but in a very different way. The special effects, the use of music, and also the camera work when the evil is pursuing them through the forest. The use of the camera there is really significant and important, and again adds to building the suspense and the horror. Your favourite moments of this film?
Well, I was going to say we're running a bit over time.
That's
so
okay.
I was going to leave it with you because I know it's one of your favourite movies.
Oh, that's okay.
I loved Bruce Campbell in this as well. And
yes.
I just think the fact that he's got such a cult following from this movie,
yes.
and still to this day, Sam Raimi always tries to put him. He's always got a cameo in one of his films. All the Spider-Man films, I think he got cameos, and anything else that's been done. And just the fact that he's so popular because of this role, a bit like Harrison Ford's popular for Indiana Jones and Han Solo. And look, it was groundbreaking. I saw it bits and pieces when I was a kid, and of course it was a bit too violent for me to be allowed to be watching it. So the first time I probably saw it was 15 years ago, maybe. I really enjoyed it, and like you said, most of the stuff like the camera work and that gritty sort of look, yeah.
Have you seen the remake?
No, I haven't. I've heard so many different reports. And this is the thing I probably should have said before when we were talking about reboots and remakes. Some of the horror ones I have gone and seen and then gone, oh yeah, that was good. And then some I've heard bad reports, and I'm like, do I really want to ruin my childhood by, say, like Nightmare on Elm Street? I didn't bother seeing that because I heard so many bad things. I haven't seen the Rob Zombie Halloween remakes, but you've spoken highly of them, so
yes.
They're probably worth having a look at. But there are some that's like, yeah, maybe it just needed to be. I can understand why they did it for this day and age, making the effects look better and making it look all creepy and whatever, but sometimes I think if you're a fan of the original, there's no need to see the new version.
Yes. We own the...
sorry, your question was Evil Dead?
Yes, sorry.
I've had people say, fantastic, didn't think I'd like it, but really loved it, and then some of it, oh my god, don't even bother. So, yeah, I'm the nerd. But I do want to revisit the whole Evil Dead, the originals. Sit back and probably have a marathon.
We've got both copies, the original and the remake, and I hated the remake because, as we've said in our first podcast, if you're doing a remake or a reboot, you need to bring something different. You're updating in some way. And I didn't feel that was the case with Evil Dead. We're going to wrap it up there. There's so much more to talk about, but we can't fit it all into one podcast. We're going to love you and leave you. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed. We'd love to hear your comments on the website. And the website URL will actually also be on the YouTube channel, just for your convenience too. But that's all from Creepy Critic Claire for this special Friday the 13th horror edition.
And Freaky Fan Geek.
Have a great Friday the 13th. Bye from me.
And bye from me.